Hey guys! So we did our investigation on the life of an aspen. Our project members are Julia Jackson, Wentao, and me, Aaliyah. So we were looking specifically at tree growth of aspens and like the speed they grow and the different factors that affect that growth. So in this picture you can see Jackson next to a big aspen tree and Julia next to a little aspen tree. So some of the things that we know to affect aspen tree growth are top-down structure, so that's predatory behavior, which determines population dynamics of ecosystem, and bottom-up structure, which is like competition for resources. So there's an example of that, of those structures on my next slide. In the area that we were looking at specifically, the predation that aspens experienced was from elk, especially on young aspens. The elk were able to bite the leaves and the tips off of that aspen, of the young aspens that they could reach, which really limited their growth, and so that would be an example of top-down structure. And then bottom-up structure, the resources that aspens compete for all the time are water and light.
So, the site we went to is called the Hayman Fire Burn Scar, located at northwest Colorado Springs. Basically, there was a forest fire in 2002, and it covered approximately 138,000 acres. But still, we see packages of trees left there because the oxygen level was not high enough in that area, so the fires was not burning efficiently. And then we have 3 poor little aspen trees selected as our study subject from 3 different areas. The tree 1 locates at the top of the edge, so due to the gravity, the precipitation will run down to the valley with nutrients. As a result, the edge usually don't have a lot of nutrient and water resources for the trees to grow. And the lucky tree 2 and tree 3 grow in the valley, so they'll get a lot of relatively water and nutrients. What's different about these 2 trees is that tree 2 grows at the brim of the forest remnant, and tree 3 just grow on the open area. And the elk like to eat in the open area instead of the woods because they can have a clear sight of the predators coming.
So the question we're asking about our 3 aspen trees is, how does the interplay between resources and the impact of elk change or affect the life histories of those trees? And we hypothesized that tree number 1, which was located at the top of the ridge, was likely to be the slowest growing tree. And that's because it was in an area that was highly accessible by elk and would actually be preferable to elk, since the ridge would give elk a lot of vision over the surrounding area where they'd be able to spot predators and feel more safe about grazing on the aspen. For tree number 2, we hypothesized it would be the second fastest growing tree. That's because it was getting decent nutrients from the downhill runoff of water, except it was also located in denser forest cover, which means that it would have been more shaded and it would not have gotten as much sunlight and would be slightly suppressed by that. But it also would not be a preferable location for elk to graze on the aspen, due to the fact that elk actually prefer to be in open spaces where they have more view, like the ridgetop. For tree number 3, we hypothesized that it would grow the fastest. That's because it is at the bottom of a ridge, so it's not the best place for elk to be, so elk grazing would be decreased there in contrast to tree number 1 at the top of the ridge. But tree number 3 would also be gaining a lot of water runoff because of the valley location, water is going to like kind of flow through there and offer a lot more water for those aspen. The methods we used to collect data for the trees required us to cut down each tree as close to the base as possible and then perform further cuts throughout the height of the tree. And we actually have a short video that shows us doing that process. And it begins with a brief overview of our tree number 2 site. And then this is us taking the initial measurement of the tree. So we took the tape measure and placed it on the very base of the tree and then measured it all the way to the tip. And after that, we took 30 centimeter increments and marked that at each point with a Sharpie. And we wrote down how much of the height of the tree that was. And that went all the way to the point of the tree that became too narrow for us to get meaningful data out of it. Would have been too small for us to really draw anything from the data and analyze it. So we went up to about 4 or 5 meters for all of the trees, slightly more for the third tree since it was taller. This is Aaliyah making a slice at one of the increments of the tree. Each slice was a small disc, and it displayed the growth rings of the tree throughout time, gradually decreasing as you go up the tree. And we just pocketed each one and brought them back to the classroom. And pretty much that was like the majority of the data collection on site. After that, the next day in the classroom was a lot more focused on really analyzing the structure of the tree cores, and that required us to use sandpaper on each one of them. There were about 40 or 50 of them, and we sanded them down until the tree rings were as apparent as we could get them. And we actually used coffee to slightly stain them because it made the rings slightly more visible and helped us count them. We counted them by eye, but we did have help from microscopes. And the way it worked is we just counted each ring from the outer edge to the base, or to the middle of the core, and that the number of rings correlates to the amount of years that tree has been alive. So as you go up the tree, there's less rings because each ring signifies older growth, and the base of the tree is the only point where you see all of the rings of the tree for the whole lifespan of that specific tree. And the data we collected from that, we put into graphs, which Julia will talk about.
Here we have the graph for tree number 1, which was located at the top of the ridge near the main road. And throughout the graph, we see kind of steady yet slow growth. At the beginning, it's a bit quicker, and we thought this was because of the nutrients that parent aspens give to the saplings and seedlings. But then it's pretty slow throughout its life, and you can see, indicated by the arrows, age 9 through 15, it was particularly slow, and this is because the height of the elk's mouths is around 2 to 3 meters, and so at this height, it's easiest for the elk to eat the aspen. And then we see at age 15 that there's kind of a release and then a sudden increase in growth, and this is because the aspen has reached the height that the elk can no longer get, and so it's at this point that the aspen can start growing at that faster rate. Looking at the graph for tree number 2, which was located in the forest fragment, we see steady slow growth up until age 5, and then these little kind of like growth spurts at a pretty rapid rate. And so the slow growth towards the beginning we think was due to the forest shading. So like the Douglas firs and the other trees in the forest shading the aspens, and the aspens not being particularly shade tolerant. But then the growth spurts after is when the aspens get to that height where they're able to reach more sunlight, and so they can grow rapidly and then reach more sunlight and then grow more rapidly and so on. And then we also don't see a obvious like plateau or like decrease in growth because the forest isn't where elk primarily eat the aspen since it decreases their range of sight. And so we don't see that, but instead we see like slower growth due to shade intolerance and the shading from the neighboring trees. Finally, we have the graph for tree number 3, which was located at the bottom of the valley. So here we can see that it kind of follows the trend line, and we see a decreased growth rate from age 5 to around age 12. However, if looking at like the slope, it's not as significantly decreased as tree number 1, so we weren't completely sure if it was due to the elk eating the aspen or if it was due to other things like the environment or nutrient availability and things like that. And so the elk could contribute to its decreased growth rate because it was in a relatively open area, yet the fact that it was located at the bottom of a valley could also affect its slope and like increase it because the water concentration and the runoff water could potentially increase that rate. And so we weren't necessarily sure if it was completely one or the other. But as we can see, around age 12, it does have that common like release as we saw in the other two graphs, and then grows more rapidly.